there is a deep wound in the heart of America, one that has never fully healed. It is a wound that was inflicted centuries ago, but it continues to bleed quietly beneath the surface of our society. That wound is the division between races, particularly between black and white Americans. And while we often speak about racism, inequality, and injustice, there's another layer to this conversation that rarely gets addressed: the psychology behind racial envy. You see, envy is a dangerous thing. It does not announce itself loudly. It doesn't wear a name tag. It hides in the corners of the human heart, and if left unchecked, it will manifest as resentment, bitterness, and even hatred. And in the case of racial envy, it becomes especially toxic because it's not just about material wealth or status. It's about identity, resilience, creativity, and spiritual strength. When we look at the historical context, we begin to understand why this envy exists. Black Americans were brought to this land in chains. They were stripped of their names, their languages, their traditions, their families. Everything that made them who they were was violently taken. And yet from that unimaginable suffering, a people rose up, not with bitterness alone, but with brilliance. Black Americans built culture from the ground up. They created music that moved the world, fashion that set global trends, art that told untold stories, and a spirit that could not be broken. They took the very soil they were forced to till and turned it into poetry, power, and pride. And while the dominant society may have claimed superiority, deep down, they watched this rise with a mix of admiration and fear. How can a people so oppressed still find the strength to sing, to dance, to lead, to shine? How can a people who were given so little give so much back to the world? That is where envy takes root, not because of what black Americans own, but because of who they are and what they've survived. Envy often masquerades as judgment. It dresses up in stereotypes and disguises itself as criticism. They're too loud. They think they're special. They're always playing the victim. But peel back the layers, and what you find is insecurity. You find people who are threatened by a resilience they don't understand, by a confidence they wish they had, by a culture they love to imitate but not honor. And when admiration is not accompanied by humility, it turns into appropriation. It becomes theft with no credit. It becomes mockery instead of appreciation. This envy is seen in the way society consumes black culture. The music, the slang, the style. It's copied, commercialized, and sold. But the people who created it are still treated as second-class citizens. Their culture is celebrated, but their pain is ignored. And the reason for this contradiction is psychological, because it's easier to steal than to heal. It's easier to copy than to confront your own emptiness. There is something powerful and magnetic about black identity. It is not just cultural, it is spiritual. It is a sense of self that has been forged in the fire of adversity. It is a rhythm that cannot be taught and a strength that cannot be explained. And for those who lack that kind of grounding in their own identity, it becomes something to envy. That's why in classrooms and boardrooms, on social media and in the streets, there is this constant tension. Some people don't want to see black people win, not because they believe black people don't deserve it, but because deep down they fear what that success reveals about their own inadequacy. But envy doesn't have to be the end of the story, because the truth is, no one needs to envy another group of people. We are all capable of greatness, but greatness doesn't come from putting others down. It comes from lifting ourselves up. It comes from doing the inner work, from asking, why am I threatened by someone else's shine? Why do I feel the need to compete with a history I don't understand? Why do I want the culture but not the struggle that built it? The answers to those questions are not easy. They require honesty. They require humility. They require a willingness to admit that America has been shaped by lies about superiority and inferiority, and that both black and white Americans have been wounded by those lies. The difference is that one group has been fighting to be seen, while the other has been fighting to stay blind. But sight is the first step to healing. When we see the envy for what it is, we can confront it. We can educate ourselves. We can learn the history not just of slavery, but of brilliance, of revolution, of creativity that has shaped the very foundation of this country. We can stop pretending that talent is colorless while continuing to erase the contributions of black minds, black leaders, black voices. And we can start giving credit where credit is due, not just in words, but in actions. For white Americans who feel this discomfort, this is not a call to shame. It's a call to responsibility. It's a chance to ask yourself what it means to truly value the people whose culture you admire, to respect their humanity, to support their freedom, to recognize their pain, and to celebrate their joy without stealing it for yourself. And for black Americans, this is a reminder of your power, that no matter how much they try to imitate you, they cannot duplicate you. Your story is not just one of survival, it is one of victory. You've been envied because you've endured. You've been watched because you've risen. You've been copied because you are original. And you don't need anyone's validation to continue becoming all that you were born to be. The psychology behind racial envy is not just a social issue, it is a soul issue. It's about how we see ourselves and how we see each other, and until we stop pretending that envy isn't there, it will continue to poison relationships, communities, and institutions. But if we confront it with courage, we can turn it into something useful. We can turn envy into admiration, we can turn resentment into reflection, and we can turn fear into understanding. There's a generation rising up that refuses to be divided by the past. They want truth, they want justice, they want unity that's not performative, but powerful. And to get there, we have to start having honest conversations about what's beneath the surface, not just about racism, but about the emotions that drive it. Envy is one of them. And the sooner we name it, the sooner we can heal from it. So let us be bold. Let us be real. Let us speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, because healing never happens in silence. Growth never happens in denial, and unity never happens without honesty. The psychology behind racial envy is a mirror, and it's time we looked into it, not to judge but to understand, not to blame but to change. And when we do, we open the door for something far greater than competition. We open the door to compassion, to connection, and to collective greatness. This is not just a message for one race or one people. This is a message for anyone who wants to be free, not just from external oppression, but from internal chains. Envy is a prison that keeps the heart locked up, and the key to unlocking it is truth, humility, and the willingness to honor what we once tried to imitate. America will only become what it was meant to be when it learns to love what it once tried to suppress. And that begins with facing the root of racial envy and choosing a better way. Many white Americans look at black culture, black resilience, and black success with a sense of fascination that they often don't understand. It's more than just interest, it's a complex mix of admiration and discomfort. There is a deep psychological tension at play when someone is drawn to the very thing they've been taught to fear, diminish, or believe is beneath them. The truth is, admiration that's not fully acknowledged often turns into something else. When people are not taught how to honor what impresses them, envy takes its place. And envy doesn't walk alone. It brings criticism, stereotyping, copying without credit, and silent resentment. That's what we often see in the social and cultural dynamics between white and black Americans. When you admire a people who have survived the worst of what society could offer, slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, systemic injustice, and still rise with excellence, creativity, and unmatched cultural influence, you're faced with a difficult truth. You are witnessing power in its purest form. It's not the kind of power that comes from privilege. It's the kind that comes from overcoming. That type of power is threatening when your sense of identity depends on believing you're already at the top. It disrupts the narrative that dominance equals superiority. So instead of celebrating it, some people choose to criticize it, dismiss it, or reduce it to stereotypes. What often gets ignored is that black identity is built from a long and painful legacy. but it didn't stay in pain. It evolved into brilliance. From the music that shaped the world, to the fashion that set global trends, to the spiritual and emotional depth that continues to inspire, black culture is a living, breathing testimony of human transformation. And yet, so much of it has been adopted by the same people who refuse to give credit where it's due. This imitation without acknowledgement becomes a form of silent envy. When you want the style, the sound, the flavor, but not the struggle, the truth, or the people, you are not admiring, you are appropriating. And appropriation is often born from the desire to possess what you know you cannot authentically create. This type of envy is hard to talk about because it isn't always loud. It's not always dressed in hate or violence. Sometimes it shows up in comments like, "They're always making it about race," or "Why do they get so much attention?" Those statements aren't just about disagreement, they're about discomfort. They come from the unease of watching someone shine in a space you were taught belonged to you. They're reactions to a kind of confidence and cultural strength that can't be borrowed. And when people feel inferior, even if only deep inside, they often try to mask it with superiority. That's why criticism becomes a weapon. It distracts from the real issue, the fear of not measuring up. But this isn't about assigning guilt. It's about understanding how human psychology works when it's not checked or educated. Envy is a natural emotion, but it becomes destructive when we let it rule us. When people aren't taught to honor differences, they often try to dominate or erase them. That's the root of racial envy. It doesn't just affect individual relationships, it shapes policies, media narratives, hiring practices, and how history is told. When society refuses to fully recognize the value and contributions of black people, but simultaneously profits from their culture, it reveals a collective insecurity. That insecurity says, "We love what you do, but we're afraid of what your success means for our identity." This is where healing has to begin with truth. No one has to feel threatened by someone else's greatness. There's room for all of us to shine. But we can't keep pretending that racial envy doesn't exist while it continues to shape attitudes and behaviors. We must name it, confront it, and work through it. That means acknowledging the pain of erasure, the injustice of cultural theft, and the disrespect that comes with imitation without recognition. It also means learning to admire openly and support genuinely, without feeling like someone else's rise takes away from your own. This is not just a conversation for white Americans to have with themselves. It's a national conversation. But white Americans especially must look inward and ask why certain aspects of black culture are adored while black people themselves are often ignored, feared, or misunderstood. That contrast reveals a psychological conflict, one that can only be resolved through honest reflection and a willingness to grow past old narratives. It requires letting go of false superiority and embracing equality in more than just words. And for black Americans, this is a reminder that the envy directed toward you is not a sign of weakness. It's a reflection of your impact. It's evidence that your story, your identity, your voice has weight, that you are not just seen, but felt. And no matter how much others may try to minimize or mimic you, the truth is you are the blueprint, not the copy. You are the origin, not the imitation. And that's something no amount of envy can ever take away. True respect comes from understanding, and understanding begins with facing what we're afraid to admit. Racial envy in America is real, and it's time we stopped running from it. Because only when we confront what's beneath the surface can we start building something better above it. The identity of black Americans has been shaped not only by history, but by a relentless will to survive, thrive, and rise in the face of overwhelming obstacles. It has been carved from generations of struggle, pain, resistance, and triumph. For centuries, black people in America have had to fight for the very things that others were handed at birth: freedom, recognition, dignity, and opportunity. Yet despite all of that, they've created something so powerful, so magnetic, that it draws the world in. The music, the style, the rhythm, the language, the attitude, these were never just cultural expressions. They were tools of survival. They were weapons of pride in a world that tried to deny black people their humanity. And this very ability to transform adversity into beauty, to take pain and mold it into power, is what unsettles many who have never had to do the same. The psychological roots of racial envy begin with the realization that despite being systemically oppressed, Black Americans continue to stand tall and influence every corner of culture. When someone has been taught they are superior because of their skin color or position in society, it becomes deeply confusing, even threatening, when another group, one that's supposed to be beneath them according to a flawed narrative, begins to dominate in the very areas that define relevance and identity in a modern world. Whether it's music, sports, fashion, entertainment, social movements, or intellectual leadership, Black Americans have continually led innovation, and this leadership doesn't just come from talent, it comes from necessity. It's born from having to create joy in the face of trauma, strength in the presence of weakness, and unity in a system built to divide. For those who have not experienced this struggle, it can be difficult to understand how that strength is developed. And what's even harder to accept is that such strength and creativity were forged without the need for validation from those in power. That's the real trigger for envy. It's not just that Black Americans succeed, it's that they do it on their own terms, outside of the framework built by the dominant group. It forces others to confront their own lack of resilience, creativity, or identity outside of privilege. And instead of learning from or honoring that, some respond with resistance, ridicule, or mimicry. This reaction is a psychological defense, one that aims to protect the ego from having to admit that those you look down on might actually be the ones setting the standard. There's a certain discomfort that arises when you benefit from a system and yet see others, who were never supposed to win, not only survive but flourish. The narrative of racial superiority begins to crack, and in those cracks, truth shines through. Black Americans have taken scraps and built empires. They've turned brokenness into rhythm, exclusion into invention, and silence into anthems. That's not just resilience, it's genius. And when that kind of genius doesn't need permission to exist, it becomes a mirror to those who have always expected to be in control. In that mirror, people are forced to see what they have failed to become despite every advantage. That is the essence of envy. It's not hate at the surface level. It's the quiet resentment that comes from wishing you had what someone else created without you. Black identity, then, is not just cultural, it's spiritual, emotional, and historical. It's not only about where one comes from, but about what one has overcome. It carries generations of memory, grief, resistance, and creativity in its bones. And that kind of identity cannot be replicated or purchased. It is earned. That's why so much of what is admired about Black people, their style, their speech, their swagger, is often copied but rarely credited. There's an underlying desire to possess the confidence and coolness of Blackness without living through the burden that gave birth to it. That again is where envy hides. It wants the crown without knowing the weight of wearing it. What fuels this tension further is how society often exploits Black excellence for profit, all while downplaying the lived experience of Black people. Black athletes fill arenas. Black musicians dominate charts. Black fashion shapes the world. But when it comes to justice, equality, or fair treatment, that same society often goes quiet. It's a contradiction that exposes a deep psychological truth. People want the product of Black struggle, but not the people behind it. And when those people demand more than just visibility, when they demand power, respect, and change, the envy becomes hostility. It morphs into denial, deflection, and sometimes violence. Because the idea of Black empowerment challenges the fragile identity of those who've been conditioned to believe they are the default of excellence. But no amount of envy can erase truth. Black identity is not just strong, it is unstoppable. It has survived everything meant to break it, and in the process it has set the tone for what the future looks like. That's why the focus now should be not on blaming those who carry envy, but on encouraging understanding and transformation. When we recognize that the root of racial envy is insecurity, we create space for education and healing. We allow for a shift from silent resentment to open appreciation. That doesn't happen through imitation, it happens through listening, learning, and honoring the full humanity of others. America has always wrestled with race, but perhaps its greatest struggle isn't just racism, it's the inability to face what Black greatness reveals about the rest of society. It reveals a truth that's hard for some to bear. That strength doesn't come from systems of power, it comes from the soul. That kind of strength can't be stolen, silenced, or sold. It's lived. And it will continue to rise regardless of who envies it. Appropriation without acknowledgement deepens the emotional and psychological divide between races in America. It's not just about borrowing styles or mimicking sounds. It's about stripping away the story and soul behind the creation, leaving only a watered-down imitation. When black music fills global charts, when black slang drives online trends, when black fashion inspires runways across the world, but the very people behind these movements are excluded from boardrooms, denied fair representation, or targeted in everyday life, that's not inclusion. That's erasure masked as appreciation. It's a quiet form of theft that stems not from admiration, but from a need to take without giving credit, to benefit without responsibility. This behavior doesn't just hurt, it dishonors the roots of creativity that were born out of struggle, identity, and resistance. When society celebrates black culture but sidelines black people, it sends a message that the product is desired, but the producer is disposable. This contradiction is not accidental, it's embedded in the psychology of envy. To deeply admire something you do not fully understand, something you feel disconnected from, creates internal tension. That tension can quickly become resentment when the source of that greatness begins to demand recognition. And when those demands go ignored, frustration builds. Black creators are often forced to watch others gain fame and wealth from styles they invented, while they themselves remain overlooked, unheard, and underpaid. What fuels this injustice is not just greed, it's the discomfort of openly honoring those who were historically viewed as inferior. So instead of celebration, there is silence. Instead of recognition, there is redirection. And instead of partnership, there is plagiarism. This dynamic is especially visible in the entertainment industry. Artists, performers, and influencers outside of the black community often adopt the aesthetics, rhythms, and slang of black culture to elevate their own platforms. But when it's time to speak out against the issues that affect black lives, many stay quiet. They enjoy the shine but avoid the shadow. That's not solidarity, it's opportunism. And this type of behavior sends a message that blackness is acceptable only when it's marketable, only when it's detached from its reality, and only when it serves the comfort of the majority. This reinforces the idea that black people must give everything, style, flavor, innovation, while receiving very little in return. Even in the academic and corporate worlds, we see the effects of this divide. Institutions often host diversity campaigns or initiatives that highlight black excellence, yet fail to create environments where black voices are genuinely heard and respected. The image is polished, but the reality remains unchanged. This selective embrace of black culture is not innocent. It's driven by a desire to appear inclusive while maintaining power structures that exclude. It's easier to wear the style than to face the story. Easier to dance to the beat than to address the pain behind it. Easier to use the language than to stand beside the people who created it. The psychology behind this kind of envy is rooted in a historical imbalance. Black people have created brilliance under conditions that were meant to erase them. That kind of creativity and spirit cannot be taught. It is forged through generational pressure, loss, pride, and hope. When others attempt to recreate it without that foundation, it always falls short. And deep down, there's an awareness of that truth. That awareness leads to frustration, not just because imitation fails to match authenticity, but because it reveals a painful fact: real influence cannot be faked. It must be lived. And when you haven't lived it, all you can do is mimic the surface. That's why appropriation stings. It's not just the act of copying, it's the denial of the origin, the story, and the struggle that gave birth to the very thing being admired. This is not just a cultural issue, it's a moral and emotional one. Appropriation without acknowledgement doesn't just rob individuals of recognition, it robs communities of dignity. It tells a generation of young black creators that their ideas are only valuable when filtered through someone else. It reinforces the lie that validation only comes when your work is worn by others. And it teaches the wider public that success is disconnected from the source. But the truth will always remain: real culture cannot be divorced from the people who created it. It is inseparable from their journey, their pain, their joy, and their power. To address this issue, America must do more than celebrate black contributions. It must respect black creators. Respect means giving credit, sharing space, and making room for those who built the very culture others profit from. It means no longer hiding behind trends and facing the truth of where those trends come from. It means acknowledging that envy, when left unchecked, breeds entitlement. And entitlement, when left unchallenged, breeds injustice. The deeper we look into this pattern, the clearer it becomes. The desire to possess what can't be naturally recreated leads to quiet theft. But the soul of black culture cannot be stolen. It can only be imitated poorly. And those who try to take it without understanding it will always fall short, because they are chasing something that is not external, but internal. Something born from centuries of experience, wisdom, and resistance. It's time we stop applauding the performance and start honoring the source, because only then will the gap between envy and appreciation finally begin to close. True healing starts with a kind of courage that many people avoid. Honest self-reflection. It's not the loudest protests or the grandest policies that change the heart of a nation. It's when individuals begin to examine what they believe and why they believe it. Envy, especially racial envy, doesn't come from facts. It comes from internal stories we carry about who we think we are and who we think others should be. It's an emotional wound that forms quietly and grows stronger when left unchallenged. To heal the racial divide in America, the conversation has to go deeper than just history books or diversity slogans. It must begin within the hearts of individuals, especially those who have inherited the benefits of a system built on imbalance. It requires a raw and often uncomfortable process of peeling back the layers of superiority that have been passed down, even unintentionally. Many white Americans have been taught, either directly or through subtle signals, that their place in society is the default, unquestioned, unchallenged, and inherently correct. That belief doesn't always wear a hateful face. Sometimes it wears a polite smile. But beneath the surface, it forms the foundation for a worldview that resists equity, because equity feels like loss to those who've always had the upper hand. When black people rise, not through handouts, but through resilience, talent, and sheer willpower, it shakes the myth of superiority at its core. It demands that people rethink the silent assumptions they've lived with. And that's not easy. When your identity is built on the idea of being ahead, someone else's success can feel like your failure. But it isn't. That's the illusion. True greatness isn't diminished when others rise. It's confirmed. But that truth is hard to swallow when your confidence is built on comparison. And for many, racial envy begins exactly there, at the intersection of admiration and fear. Admiration for the strength, style, intelligence, and creativity of black Americans, and fear that these qualities might expose the hollowness of one's own accomplishments. That fear isn't about the people being envied. It's about what their excellence reveals. It shows how much of one's identity has been shaped not by self-discovery, but by inherited privilege. That realization can either open the door to growth or trigger defensiveness. Unfortunately, many choose the latter. It feels safer to resent what you don't understand than to investigate the discomfort it causes. This process of reflection isn't just a moral responsibility. It's a necessity if America is ever to move forward. It requires asking difficult questions. What beliefs have I absorbed that I never questioned? How has history shaped my perspective, even when I didn't notice? What makes me uncomfortable about the rising power of black voices, and why? These are not accusations, they are invitations. They are not meant to shame, but to awaken. Because until people start acknowledging the stories they've believed, stories about who deserves what, who belongs where, and who defines success, they will always struggle to see others clearly. And without clarity, there can be no true unity. It's also vital to understand that healing isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. Guilt is passive. It keeps people stuck in emotion without action. Responsibility, on the other hand, is empowering. It allows people to see how they participated in a system, even unintentionally, and then do something about it. It moves the conversation from blame to transformation. And that transformation begins when people stop seeing equity as a threat and start seeing it as an opportunity to grow. Racial envy cannot survive in a space where self-worth isn't based on being better than someone else. When your value is rooted in your own purpose, someone else's power doesn't scare you. It inspires you. What's powerful about Black American resilience is that it doesn't rely on comparison. It is not built on the need to be above anyone. It is built on survival, creativity, and a deep understanding of self. That kind of grounded identity doesn't seek permission to exist. It simply exists. And that's where envy often takes hold, in the shadow of that unshakable confidence. But if more people saw that confidence not as a threat but as a lesson, there would be less fear and more admiration. And from admiration, real respect can grow. Not the surface-level kind that celebrates culture while ignoring the people, but the kind that listens, learns, and evolves. So much of America's healing depends on whether people are willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of confronting their own emotional reactions. Because racism doesn't just exist in policies. It lives in patterns, in assumptions, and in unspoken comparisons. And envy is one of its oldest tools. It clouds judgment, distorts reality, and blocks compassion. But when you shine light on it, when you name it, understand it, and choose to rise above it, you take the first real step toward change. You stop being threatened by someone else's story and start writing a better one for yourself. And in doing so, you contribute not just to a more equal society, but to a more honest one. That is where real healing begins. Celebration must replace competition to achieve unity. When we constantly view progress through the lens of rivalry, we fall into the trap of thinking that success is a limited resource. But greatness is not scarce, it's expansive. There is more than enough space in this world for all cultures, all people, and all histories to be acknowledged, respected, and valued. The real power in a nation like America is its diversity. But that power can only be activated when we stop comparing and start appreciating. When one group rises, it doesn't mean another must fall. And yet too often the rise of Black Americans is met not with applause but with resistance, not with curiosity but with critique. That resistance comes from a mindset built on fear, fear of losing status, of being replaced, of facing a past that has long been ignored. But that fear is not grounded in truth. In reality, elevating others does not take away from your light. It simply adds more light to the room. The need to compete, to always be ahead, to maintain dominance, these are ideas rooted in insecurity, not strength. Real confidence celebrates the wins of others because it isn't shaken by them. But when someone's sense of worth is deeply tied to being better than, they will always view someone else's success as their own failure. And this is the quiet foundation of racial envy in America. It whispers that recognition for Black excellence somehow means less recognition for everyone else. It spreads the false belief that justice for one group threatens the comfort of another. But true justice isn't subtraction, it's restoration. It adds value back where it was long denied. To heal from this, we must shift the focus away from comparison and into compassion. That means not just tolerating Black achievements, but honoring them. Not just enjoying Black culture, but uplifting Black people. It means recognizing that the world doesn't lose anything when equity is practiced. Instead, it gains more balance, more talent, more vision, more humanity. So many of the things that define American culture today, from music and fashion to language and innovation, are rooted in Black creativity. Yet too often the contributions are celebrated without acknowledging the people behind them. That's not appreciation, that's extraction. And extraction feeds envy because it leaves the source empty while others profit. But when we replace that extraction with inclusion, something shifts. We stop seeing each other as competitors and begin to see each other as collaborators. When admiration replaces appropriation, the dynamic becomes healing instead of harmful. We begin to realize that every culture, every history, every voice brings something vital to the table. Black success, then, becomes something to learn from, not to fear. It becomes a source of wisdom, not rivalry. And in that shift, we start building a society that doesn't just look diverse on the surface, but feels equal at its core. Education plays a major role in this transformation. Many people are not intentionally envious, they're simply uninformed. They don't understand the weight of the past or the barriers that still exist today. They don't see how deep the roots of inequality run, or how much unacknowledged strength it takes to rise in the face of that. But when people are educated, not just with facts but with stories, with empathy, with human connection, they start to wake up. They start to question the beliefs they never challenged. They start to see that we're all part of the same story, just on different pages. And once that happens, it's hard to go back to envy, because knowledge expands the heart. It makes room for respect where there was once rivalry. Replacing envy with admiration requires a level of honesty that many people avoid. It asks us to admit when we've benefited from systems that weren't fair. It challenges us to acknowledge the efforts and achievements of those who weren't given the same starting line. But this isn't about guilt, it's about growth. It's not about looking back to blame, but to learn. Because only by understanding how far we've come and how far we have to go can we truly walk forward together. Unity cannot exist in a space where people are constantly trying to outshine each other. It can only exist where people recognize that every individual's success contributes to the whole. A society that celebrates all of its people, openly, sincerely, and consistently, is a society that thrives. Black success does not diminish American success, it defines it. It is a testament to the strength, brilliance, and endurance that built this country just as much as any other story. So if we want to move forward, the shift must be internal first. It must begin with individuals choosing to cheer instead of compete, to lift up instead of tear down, to acknowledge instead of ignore. Because when we do that, we create a culture where no one has to dim their light for someone else to shine. We create a world where envy gives way to empowerment, where admiration becomes the foundation for allyship, and where unity becomes more than just an idea, it becomes reality.